Today I'm doing something that I've never done before, a live virtual conference to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of delegates from around the world in this film studio that we're sitting in right now. And my special guest is James Caan from Dragon's Den, who has done 53 business acquisitions during his career, and he's going to be explaining how he has also bought businesses in a no money down fashion. It is going to be entertaining, it's going to be motivating, and it's going to be educational as well. So in 30 minutes, we go live to hundreds and hundreds of delegates around the world. This is the stage, and that big screen there is where we are going to see some of their faces from their homes and their offices, wherever they are in the world. On that screen over there, we're going to be able to see what people can see at home, so I know what everyone is watching. Over here, I've got my PowerPoint, and that screen is where the questions are going to be sent in to myself, my guest in the studio, and my guest at home. James Caan joining us from sunny Monaco as well. We've got just 29 minutes to go before we go live, so I need to get changed. I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, should we let some people in then? Goodness me, there are so many. We've got Lee Blythe from Melbourne, Australia. We've got Gary Holmes from Stroud in the southwest. We've got Simon Bedford. We've got Wendy from Cheshire. We have got hundreds of people joining us from all around the world. Welcome, everyone. It is good to have you here. If you've been onto one of my events before, you know that this is slightly different. We've upped our game with the presentation here. We're in an amazing studio, and you might be able to spot yourself if you look at the screens behind me. We'll be starting in just a few moments' time when we've let everyone in. We've got still got people in the waiting room waiting to come on to the event today. Hi, Alison from Glasgow, looking forward to the session. Isaac from Yorkshire, Andrew from Dundee. We've got John from Surrey. We've got Zach from Hampstead in London. Hi, Rob Shute from Netherlands. Rob's one of my private clients. Good to have you here, Rob. Rob's done very well with I think you're onto your second acquisition now, Rob, aren't you, over there in Holland? Stephen from Ireland, looking forward to hearing from myself and James. Yes, I'll be introducing you to James Caan in just a short while. We've got Nick from Cirencester. Hi, Nick. Thanks for the mention, says Jacob. No problem at all, Jacob. Happy to oblige. Good to have you all here. We've got Andrew John from California. We've got Michael from Richmond upon Thames. I live in Richmond upon Thames. Are you my stalker, Michael? Good to have you here. We've got Nicholas Hodgson from South London. We've got Steve from Leeds. We've got people from all over, and we're just warming up here, ready for the start in just a few moments' time. We're just letting everyone into the waiting room. From the waiting room into the live event, and once everyone is here, we will be able to get started. Now, if you've been to one of my events before, one of my webinars before, you'll know that I'm going to be showing you some of the smart things you can do around business acquisition and how you can apply this to your sector, your industry, and if you don't yet have a sector or industry, how you can find a business to buy regardless of not being in business at the moment. And I know some of you follow my business acquisitions on LinkedIn. If we're not connected on LinkedIn, send me a connection request and I'll accept it. And many of you are watching my YouTube videos. We've really upped the game on the YouTube videos in the last few weeks. Don't know whether you've noticed that. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, then do that now. Go over to Jonathan J on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. Lots of great content over the last few weeks where I've got a camera crew following me around to my most recent acquisitions. I've done 28 deals in the last 20 months, all in the early years childcare sector. We're creating one of the largest groups in the UK. In just 18 months, we created the 13th largest group in the UK, which shows what you can do if you've got an acquisition strategy and you know how to acquire businesses. Interestingly, the 12 childcare groups above us in that list of 13, we're at number 13, are all either listed on the stock exchange, backed by a pension fund, or a private equity backed. We are the only 100% privately owned nursery group using the strategies that we're going to be talking about today. I've got two of my private clients. We've got Nick and we've got Chris here today, and they are going to be sharing with you how they made their first acquisition. So let me just do a time check. I think we're all here. So let's get started. So today, if we can just move to the slides for a moment, that would be great. Today, you can expect to be inspired, motivated, and educated to buy a business successfully in 2021. So that's what today is all about. It's about inspiring you, motivating you to make you realize that you can do this regardless of your starting point, and also teaching you some of the fundamentals that you need to buy a business successfully. And I think it's fair to say that many people buy businesses unsuccessfully, but what we're talking about today is buying those businesses successfully. So let me tell you today's agenda so you know what's coming up and you know what to expect. And I would like you to stay with us all the way through to the end of today's session, because no one part is more valuable than the rest. So first, I'm going to be doing a quick introduction to two of my clients, Chris and Nick, both of which I've helped with their recent acquisitions. They're going to be telling you how they found the deals, how they put the deals together, how they got the deals over the line. So they'll be sharing some behind-the-scenes information on that. And then we're going to move to our extremely experienced deal maker, James Caan, who's done, I believe, 53 transactions during his career, with some very, very sizable ones along the way. So I'll be interviewing James and finding out his philosophy around business acquisition and how he would fund business acquisitions and what he looks for during due diligence. And I can tell you that what he looks for during due diligence is probably different to what most of us would look for during due diligence. But we'll come to James's story later. And then I'm going to ask Nick Manuel, one of my clients, to come up here on the stage with me. He's here in the studio live. And Nick is going to be sharing with you how he made his first acquisition in the time frame, which was incredibly tight. He just had 3 weeks to do it, from finding out about the deal to completing on it in just 3 weeks. And he's going to give you an update on what that business is now worth to him in his growing business portfolio. And then we'll move to Chris Stone from Scotland. And Chris is in a very, very different sector to Nick. Nick is in commercial printing and signage and balloon printing and that sort of thing. He'll give you the more technical phrases for that later, I'm sure. And then Chris is in the audiology world. So he has an audiology clinic, and he's going to tell you how he's just bought another audiology clinic and about the 2 deals that he's got in the pipeline and how it has saved him years of organic growth by doing these acquisitions and doing them in the space of a few months. And then, if you like what you've been hearing, if you like what you see, I have something happening next week, just next week, starting on Monday, where if you want to buy a business, I can help you do that. But I'll tell you about that later on. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers to Nick and Chris, because you will want to know, what goes on behind the scenes when you buy a business. Were you worried about having credibility? Were you worried about what that business owner would say if they knew that you'd never bought a business before? What have been the teething problems? You'll want to know all those things, and we're going to do that in the Q&A session later on. So first of all, I want you to meet Chris and Nick. Let's start with Nick. Nick's here in the studio. So let's do a virtual round of applause for Nick. Let's see you. That's it. A little bit more enthusiasm, I think. Nick, take a seat. So, good to meet you. Thank you for coming over to the studio.
No problem.
So, give us, first of all, a little bit of background as to what type of business you're in, and then tell us what you're going to be talking about later on.
So, I'm in the signage large format printing industry. I'm now in a balloon printing industry as well, which kind of works hand in hand. So we specialise in signage, large format graphics, retail graphics, installations, and now we also print balloons for events and have an e-commerce business that goes alongside that.
Now, I think, if I'm getting the timings right, we met about a year ago?
It was, about a year ago today. Yeah.
Okay. and you'd never bought a business before.
Never. No.
What were you thinking at the time? Because you probably attended a webinar similar to this, maybe, I don't know, but maybe you did.
Yeah.
What were you thinking at the time about, what were the doubts going through your mind?
I didn't think that people would have confidence in me. I didn't have the experience. I didn't think, I thought we'd need a lot of money, which in fact, that isn't necessarily the case. I think the main doubt for me was the credibility of my age, which I've now overcome. And I don't find that a problem.
You were worried you were too old. I know what you mean, because sometimes there are these stories that we tell ourselves. We're too old, we're too young, whatever it might be that holds us back. So you overcame that self-doubt.
Yep.
And how do you feel now?
Amazing, confident. Feel like I could take over the world. I'm not sure
Fantastic.
if that's...
and you've got a big deal on the horizon, right?
I've got a big deal floating about on the horizon, yeah.
So getting that first deal over the line was instrumental to knowing that you can do it, and you can do it bigger and bigger.
Yeah, exactly. And what I've noticed is actually that the bigger deals, they're a bit more, not exciting, but they fit into my industry better.
Yes.
But I've got the confidence now to go and do a deal of that size.
Yeah, and the credibility, because you can talk about your previous deal, which always helps. It's just getting that first one over the line as quickly as possible. So when we have a conversation about this later on, I want you to explain to everyone how you put that first deal together, how you found out about it, how you contacted the owner, the conversation you had with the owner, how you structured the deal, if you're happy to share those details. Yeah. And then very, very importantly, because everyone always wants to know this, they want to talk about the money, what it cost you, and what it's worth to you as well. Are you happy to share
Absolutely.
that level of detail? And maybe also share with everyone some tips.
Yeah.
Because any shortcuts that you can give people, I think, would be helpful.
Yeah. I've learned a bit along the way of this one. For sure.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot. If there was one tip to share right now, what might that tip be?
Oh, that's a tough question.
And I'm putting you on the spot. It doesn't have to be the biggest, best tip, just one tip. About getting started, perhaps.
Yes, just get on with it. Send letters out.
Just get on with it.
Yeah, you've got to do it to learn fully the ins and outs of what to look for.
And I think that, if I'm just talking to everyone here, because you and I had this conversation like a year ago, and then you went out and did it. There are a lot of people who talk about buying a business, think about buying a business, read books about buying a business, go on webinars, go on virtual conferences about buying a business, but don't actually do anything with it. What made you different? What made you the person who said, you know what, I'm not going to just sit in an audience, I'm actually going to get going and do something?
Coming on the course, being surrounded by people that are like-minded, that then motivate you to get on with it.
So they motivated you to get on with it. Was there a little bit of benchmarking as well when you come along to a meeting and you discover other people are doing things?
Yeah, you'd want to be top of the class.
Yeah. You don't want to be left behind, right?
No.
Fantastic. Nick, we're going to have a longer conversation about this later because we want to get into the detail of it because everyone wants the details.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that introduction.
No problem.
We'll come back to you in a few moments.
Okay.
Thank you. And so that's Nick Manuel. We'll be coming back to Nick later. And now we've got Chris Stone, who's joining us virtually from Scotland. Can we bring Chris in, please? Thank you. We're just finding Chris. He's there somewhere. Chris, I believe you can speak.
Hi, Jonathan. Have you got me?
Hi. Yes, we've got you. We can hear you loud and clear. Good to have you here, Chris.
Yeah, nice to see you.
So, Chris, tell us, because you're in a very different business to Nick, because what I want to really emphasize today is that the strategies for buying a business can be applied to any sector, wherever you are in the world. So tell us briefly about your sector and what you have done with your first acquisition.
Sure. So since being on the course, we've been scoping out to acquire a run of small businesses, roughly about the same size of ours, but we started thinking about buying bigger, growing a big group, getting it to say 10, 15 million sort of in revenue a year, and then possibly selling it on to one of the bigger sort of players in the market. So
I've got
you'll find.
Sorry to interrupt, Chris, but I've got a question for you that I'm going to ask you the questions that I know other people were thinking. If you weren't going to do acquisitions, if you weren't going to buy other people's businesses, and you were just growing your existing business organically, so one customer today, one customer tomorrow, two the next day, and so forth, then you lose a customer, then you add a couple of customers, how long would it take you to get to that 15 million?
That's a good question. What I can tell you is, starting from scratch, a practice of audiologists maybe do $250,000 a year, thereabouts, as a kind of owner-operator. We're now quite substantially bigger than that, but it's taken us sort of 4 or 5 years to break the million mark, and that's growing fast. Double-digit year-on-year growth isn't always easy to sort of do in an organic way. Most businesses don't achieve double-digit growth, and we felt that we just had to ramp things up faster because life's too short to be sitting about. We wanted to really kind of take the bull by the horns and go for it.
So it took you how long to get to $1 million?
So we were 4.5 years till we got to the $1 million turnover. That's about average, I guess. And it was only ever going to grow at sort of 10, 15% year on year after that with the organic growth.
Without giving too much away, because I want the full story from you later, it took you 4.5 years to get to 1 million of revenue. The next jump from 1 million to 2 to double the size of your business has taken how long?
Yeah, so from there it took another 3 years. And then we've added an extra $1 million on in turnover through 2 acquisitions which we've done over a 6 month span. So
that's the time frame I was looking for. So it took you 6 months to do 2 acquisitions that took you up another $1 million.
Another $1 million. We've got another 800,000 acquisition in the pipeline as well.
Great. So when you
get 3 a month a year.
So when you said life is too short, I think that's a sentiment that everyone has, sometimes stronger than others, depending on what's happening around us. So growing that rapidly, does your 15 million now seem like a very clear outcome as opposed to maybe a bit of a dream that you might have had a few years ago?
I think on the trajectory we're on right now, it's a definite possibility, and we're planning it over the next 5 years. But if we land 1 or 2 big fish, we might be able to even, cut that time frame down as well.
And what does it mean to you when you reach that 15 million? What does that mean to you personally? What does it mean to the business?
So our business in our sectors, businesses are often sold based largely on the turnover. So $1 million a year business is sold for about £1 million, 2 million revenue, £2 million. But once you get north of the sort of 8, 9, 10 million in revenue, they start adding on a much greater multiplier. So once we get to 10 million, maybe even 12, 15 million, we could go for 1.3, maybe 1.5 times our turnover. So we could be looking at an end-of-day sellout of about 18 million. That's the plan.
It's a very good plan. 18 million is a nice chunky amount of money. And again, without giving too much away, because I want to do the in-depth interview later, but the acquisition that you've just done since we've known each other, how much money out of your own pocket did you have to spend to buy that business?
Zero, absolutely zero. And this, as you say, not giving too much away, we can go into it in a bit of detail, was the thing that surprised me the most, because I had a misconception that I was going to have to borrow lots of money down and take the whole purchase price and buy the owner out. And there's a huge risk in that as well, of the owner running off with the money and us left with an empty shell of a business. But you definitely showed us ways around de-risking that. And obviously one of them is not putting our own money in either, which is tremendous from our perspective.
Brilliant. We'll talk about that in more detail later, Chris. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you later on. Lovely. Thank you. So we'll be talking in detail to Chris and Nick a little bit later on, and then towards the end of our conference today, you'll be able to ask them questions and you'll be able to get the answers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for. So let's meet James Caan. Now, James Caan really needs no introduction. If you've ever watched Dragon's Den, without doubt, he was the most popular dragon on Dragon's Den. I believe he made the most investments on Dragon's Den as well. And I believe James is joining us from, is it Monaco, James?
It is. It's not Morocco, it's Monaco.
It is definitely Monaco. Did I say Morocco earlier?
No,
Oh,
I'm
right.
just anticipating.
Okay. So, James, good to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Now, there'll always be one or two people who haven't come across you. Maybe they're people joining us from outside of the UK. Would you just give a brief synopsis of your business experience so that we can understand how you can speak with such authority about buying a business?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. So my background is I started my career in the recruitment business. So like a lot of entrepreneurs, I set up a small recruitment business in a broom cupboard in Pall Mall. There was me, the Yellow Pages, the desk, and the valuable telephone. And I had a vision to build a global human capital business. The business I founded and created was a business called Alexander Mann. And today, Alexander Mann is the world's #1 talent solutions provider, employs 7,500 people in 27 countries with revenues of just over 950 million. So for me, it was an incredible journey that I thoroughly enjoyed, and it created the business that I'm today extremely proud of. I sold that business in 2005 to a private equity firm. And from the capital that I generated, I created my own sort of family office. So effectively taking that capital to acquire and build another business. Because Alexander Mann was my baby, it was a startup, it took 17 years to go from kind of zero to exit. And now that I'm a little bit older, a bit more grey hair, I didn't want to put another 17 years. So the strategy kind of second time round was what we call buy and build. So buy existing businesses to achieve scale. And the two lessons that I learned, Jonathan, was that I found quite unusual and something you wouldn't normally expect. But if you're looking to build a business to exit, what I found is there are more buyers, the bigger the business is, than there are for small businesses. And the reason is because private equity firms spend a huge amount of time and effort in raising capital. And when they've raised money, they generally raise anywhere between 500 to a billion. So for them, it takes just as long to do a 20 million deal than it does a 50 million deal. And the amount of time and effort that they take to do that, plus because they have this huge pool of capital, they are charged with deploying it. So doing small deals is quite inefficient for them. So one of the things that I saw was if I was to build scale, I would get a higher premium because it's safety in numbers and people are less nervous when you're buying a boutique business. But also you get a bit more competition for the business and therefore you get a bit of a premium. So the last business I sold, I got 8.6 times earnings, and that was primarily because I had acquired that business on 1.8 million EBIT, which I paid 5.5 times income for, and I exited that on an 11.4 million EBIT at 8.6 times. And what I did, the gap between the 1.8 and the 11.4 was I effectively bought acquisitions where I identified complementary businesses in the market, in the sector, and was able to effectively add to create scale. And then when I had over £10 million worth of profit, when we eventually did sell, I sold to a UK private equity firm called Graphite Capital. But the good news is I had 3 buyers who were interested in the deal, and the initial offer started at 7.5 times earnings, and we closed at 8.6. So my background effectively is kind of owner, manager, entrepreneur, and then effectively became like an investor to buy businesses to scale. So that's a whistle top of my background, Jonathan.
It's a great introduction, and it's very relevant to what people here want to know more about. And I think that sometimes business owners can be stuck in a small business for so long, and it becomes so frustrating. They never get that scale because they are acquiring one customer today, another one tomorrow, and it's very, very frustrating. Where if you can go and buy, like we heard in Chris's example a few moments ago, you can go and buy £800,000 of revenue, another £1 million of revenue. You just speed up the process. And as you said, you didn't want to spend, was it another 17 years?
Indeed,
grinding it out.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So when it comes to funding acquisitions, there is a misconception that you need to put everything on the line to buy a business. In fact, sometimes people almost encourage this belief that you must remortgage your house. You must put your life savings into the deal. Yeah, it's got to be an absolutely, you've got to live your life on a knife edge when you buy that business. But you and I know that that isn't the case. So could you talk for a little bit about financing deals without risking your entire personal financial life at the same time?
Yeah. So I've never, what we call in the trade, bet the farm on an acquisition, meaning I haven't put my entire wealth on the line to acquire a business. So typically what I have found and I think each sector has its own nuances and its own characteristics, but in the sector that I operated in, which was effectively professional services and the recruitment sector, the first thing I learned was, number one, you don't have to buy 100% of the company. So when you're looking at acquisitions, my starting position was never that I need 100%. And actually, as a policy, I never acquired 100% because I want the business to succeed. And when I acquire that business, I want the founders of the acquiring business to be aligned with me. So my model was, I ideally, and every deal is different, but my kind of ideal model was I wanted to buy 2/3 and I wanted the existing owners to retain 1/3. So that, of course, immediately brings your acquisition price down quite considerably. Secondly, if the business that I'm currently running today is profitable and the business that I'm acquiring is profitable, what the banks are always interested in is how do you service a loan? So the combination of the two profit streams of your business and the acquiring business gives you an ability to service debt. And typically my model, that what I had agreed with the bank, which was HSBC, was they would lend me typically 2 times the combined EBIT of the business that we were going to create. So if you just make up the numbers for the sake of it, if my business was making £500,000 profit and I was going to acquire a business that was going to make £500,000, the combination of the two is £1 million. Therefore, the serviceability of the debt, what I had was £1 million to service the debt. And if the business I was acquiring, for the sake of argument, was making £500,000, that means, and if I was going to typically pay anywhere between 4 to 5.5 times earnings, depending on the size, the scale, the profitability, there's a lot of variables, but just take 4 as a simple number, then effectively 4 times 500 is 2 million. I've already got an agreed facility with HSBC, which is 2 times. So I've got £1 million of debt to do that deal. Bearing in mind, I'm only buying 2/3. Therefore, I don't actually need 2 million. I only need 1.3, of which I've got £1 million of debt anyway. What I then found was when I acquire a business, a lot of businesses in recruitment have outstanding receivables. So outstanding where they are owed money. And one of the things that I learned was not every business that I bought had an invoice discounting facility. And some of the businesses were effectively funding their own receivables. So I could then use the invoice discounting method by taking their receivables to borrow against the receivables as well. So if, for the sake of argument, my debt was 1 million, and depending on what the size of their receivables were, I could generally draw anywhere between 100 to 200 against the receivables, meaning that all I would need effectively is like 100,000 of what you call equity in order to do the deal. So I think the funding was a mixture for A, not buying 100% and therefore limited the amount of money that I needed, B, agree with the bank, the debt facility, and C, use the existing business that I'm acquiring because I own more than 51% and therefore I can consolidate it and leverage the receivables of that business in order to make the acquisition. So as Jonathan rightly said, when making the acquisition, I could effectively acquire a business making 500,000 EBIT, where my outlay, probably from an equity perspective, would be anywhere between 100 and 200,000 pounds, depending on each transaction.
Very interesting, which is contrary to what people believe, which is you have to go and borrow all of the money to pay all of the consideration on day one. The seller walks off into the sunset with all of your money, and you're left with all of the business, and you've got to sort it out afterwards. So,
which is why, Jonathan, I don't buy 100%.
Yeah.
Because when the owner still owns a third, then there is no sunset for him to walk to, because he's still locked into the business.
And this is the classic private equity model, isn't it?
Yeah, and also I think it's important to realise that banks are rarely ever going to lend you 100% of the acquisition price. A bit like when you buy a property, they never really want to lend you 100%. The typical debt size is between 50 and 60%.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the incentive to the owner is to build the business on your behalf with you, because they're going to potentially make more money on the secondary buyout 3 years, 4 years, 5 years into the future.
Correct.
So when we talked before, we chatted about a £12 million acquisition that you did in this fashion. Could you explain a little bit about that one, please?
Yeah, so I had just sold Alexander Mann, and I wanted effectively to do it again, but this time around not organic, but what we call buy and build. And the one Jonathan's referring to was my kind of first foray back into the market. So I identified a business that was making 1.8 million profit. I valued the business at between 5.5 and 6 times earnings, got to an agreed valuation of 12 million. We bought roughly 2/3 of that, which meant we roughly spent 8 million. And the thing that I hadn't quite realized until we did due diligence, this was a business that had been going for nearly 20 years and had always been fairly cash positive, and therefore the owners had never looked to borrow money, and they funded the business through profitability. Because of the nature of the business, it had a very large contract business, which they funded themselves, but it had an outstanding receivable balance when we acquired the business of nearly 10 million. And when we were looking to do the debt financing, the bank had offered us 85% of the invoice discounting. So what I found staggering was I acquired the business, 2/3 of it, and because we were more than 51%, we had control. So we effectively parted with the 8 million. And then within 3 months of acquiring the business, we did a refinancing of the debt book and effectively released the entire 8.5 million. And effectively, when we put the money in at the 8 million, we put it in as a loan into the company, refinanced the debtor book, repaid the loan back to ourselves, and therefore the acquisition effectively cost us 0. We then spent the next 6 years adding to that business, and we made 6 acquisitions and effectively got it to just over 11 million profit. And when we sold that, we sold it for just under 100 million and repaid back the loans that we'd borrowed. But what we had done is a lot of the surplus cash that we were generating, we used that to pay back some of the debt. Because obviously when you sell a business, the model is it's enterprise value less debt. So whatever debt exists in the business comes off the purchase price. And therefore, I'm always keen to reduce the debt as I go along, because at the end, when I sell, I obviously want to maximize on the return to shareholders.
Very smart indeed. I'm sure there'll be some questions about this in a few moments. But you mentioned due diligence. I know that you have a very different focus on due diligence than what people might typically assume. You obviously look at the commercial aspects, you look at the legal aspects, you look at the financial aspects, but you also look at the people, don't you?
So I think what I do is I've split my function into kind of two. So I'm lucky enough to have an internal team who does the due diligence. So I think currently we've done 53 transactions, and there are effectively two lessons we've learned. Is that when they go wrong, there are generally two reasons why an acquisition goes wrong. One, the people you are backed or that you've acquired culturally don't fit, and your interests are not aligned. And that creates, tension and friction and can lead to the transaction failing. So I think people, without a question of doubt, is the one single factor that we've experienced. And secondly, due diligence. So when we've acquired a business and it doesn't work out, we always kick ourselves because we find out something after the event that frankly we should have picked up at the beginning that now causes us problems. And I think what happens, just from our own experience, sometimes we fall in love too quickly and we become too emotional because we love it and it's exciting, etc. And we compromise on the due diligence that we do. And regressively, we then end up paying dearly. And so what we do in my own particular situation is I focus on the people. So typically an acquisition for us takes between 3 to 4 months. So I'm effectively courting the management team during that period. And my team is doing both operational, financial, legal due diligence along the way. It's so important from a people perspective that you need to do both business and social. So I have lots of breakfasts, lots of lunches, lots of dinners with management teams because I want to catch them outside of a boardroom and say, are these the people I can work with? Do we culturally fit? Do we see eye to eye? What's it going to be like? Because this is not, one date. This is a long-term relationship. We're going to be together, could be for the next 3 to 5 years, and therefore it's got to be deep and meaningful. And I would say that when we don't do a deal, it is rarely because of due diligence. It's more because we feel uncomfortable that the cultural fit doesn't work.
Which is absolutely intrinsic to the success of your acquisitions because you are always leaving the owner or the management team in there because you need them to build the business up to the next level.
Indeed, indeed.
So could you give us an example perhaps of where something's gone awry, where a deal has gone off the rails?
Yeah. So when I first set up, my strategy wasn't necessarily to do recruitment. I kind of had an opposite view, and I thought, well, I've been in recruitment all my life. Now that I made some money, I want to do something different. And I went to a lot of the accounting firms, the KPMG, the Grant Thorntons, etc., and said, what have you got that I can buy? And KPMG said, we've got something you might be interested in. It's a sandwich shop called Benji's. It's been around 30 years. It's got 120 stores across the UK. It's got 50 million of revenue, employs 600 people. And it's hit on some rough times at the moment. And I thought, wow, sandwich shops, everybody needs a sandwich, everybody goes to lunch, the market's booming, it's doing really well. And so we looked at it, and at the time when I bought it, the private equity firm that had bought it beforehand bought it making 4.5 million profit, and they were now selling it at break even. So they'd paid roughly 25 million, and I think I picked it up at the time for about 2. And, it always reminded me what my mother's always said to me: when something's cheap, it's always cheap for a reason. But there's no such thing as cheap. Anyway, so we bought it, it had problems, and I made the classic schoolboy error. Just because I had one business that had succeeded, it doesn't mean that everything you do applies the same way. And we kept the business for 6 months. We couldn't move the dial, we couldn't move the needle, and we lost the 2 million we put in, and we lost another 800,000 of additional working capital we had to put in. So a terrible experience. On reflection, what did I do wrong? What I did wrong was go into a market I knew nothing about. I had no background, no experience, and no knowledge of that sector. We were dealing with perishable foods, which have a short lifespan, and therefore the skill set that I needed to be an owner of that business in understanding the consumer, a high street brand, a product that I'd never been used to. And what I hadn't quite appreciated is consumers are incredibly price sensitive, more than, because if I'm really honest, I wasn't a classic customer of Benji's, and therefore the gap between me understanding the psyche of my customer, I wasn't qualified for. So if the truth be told, everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong, and I probably made all of the mistakes at the same time. The good news is, I knew my own failings, and within a relatively short period of time, i.e. 6 months, I decided to call it a day, because a friend of mine said to me, your first loss is your best loss. If you've got it wrong, don't procrastinate, because every week that decision is taking you was costing us, I think, £85,000 a week. And it kind of focuses the mind of saying, how good do I feel? Because if I'm not confident, I will burn another £1 million very quickly. So at the end of the 6-month period, we said, hands up, got this one wrong, and took the write-off.
Okay, so an observation and a question. So the observation is that this is what I say to people all the time. You buy a business that does something that you understand. Otherwise, you have to learn the business and also learn how to buy the business. So your first acquisition should always be something that you have some knowledge of, maybe even knowledge of as an experienced customer. And again, interesting you should say that you weren't a typical customer of Benji's. So that's, and the question is, how do you protect against personal risk? Because that's many people's big fear. I buy a business, it goes wrong, I lose my house. That's what goes through people's minds. I mean, it's not necessarily very logical, but that's what people do think. So what would you say about minimizing personal risk?
I think it is making sure that you don't give a personal guarantee. So the way that you are exposed personally is generally when you are personally guaranteeing either the loan or the acquisition, at which point failure can be directly on your doorstep. But in the event that you are acquiring the business within a limited company framework, and so, for example, in Benji's case, we put the money into the company failed, therefore we lost our money, but we didn't personally guarantee any of the liabilities, and therefore I didn't risk my house. And having done 53 transactions today, you would think I'm pretty good at what I do, but I still wouldn't give a personal guarantee, because the one lesson that I've learned, if something can go wrong, it generally does. And, I think the current pandemic we are in should be a great reminder to all of us that none of us could ever have predicted this, but it did happen. And in some businesses and some industries, it's been catastrophic. And therefore, when you are giving a personal guarantee, you are taking a massive risk. And the only way to eliminate that risk is just don't do it.
So you've mentioned the pandemic. There's a worldwide recession. It has been a very miserable time for a lot of people. But from the perspective of a business buyer, and I have to say this cautiously because I don't want anyone to misunderstand or misinterpret what I'm saying, but is there opportunity for the astute business buyer over the next few years?
I think there are sectors for sure that have been more affected than others, and that creates a buying opportunity. The thing that I would be very cautious about is where the opportunities lie. They lie for a reason. And it is really important to understand that reason very well, because when something looks too good to be true, it normally is. And just because it's cheap is not a reason to want to buy it. And if the business has fallen on difficult times, you have to investigate that very thoroughly, because you are buying a problem. And unless you understand how to solve the problem, unless you have the answer, then, we must remind ourselves of the definition of insanity, which is to do more of the same and expect a different result. It doesn't happen.
Yeah, I always say never buy a business that's making a loss unless you can answer two questions. Why is it making a loss, and can I fix it? And if you know why it's making a loss and you know how to fix it, then maybe it is a good deal. But if you don't know the answer to those questions, you should be running in the opposite direction. Yeah. So finally, let's talk about the integration of businesses into a group. You mentioned the culture fit earlier. What are the issues surrounding, if you're doing a buy and build, building that group, and what are the things that could go wrong? Let's not just talk about the positive. What could go wrong?
So I'll give you a live example, and I feel pretty bad about this. So we sold a business in February 2020. So we'd been approached by a buyer in 2019 in December, and who approached me and said, look, I really love one of your brands. It's a business I really admire and respect. You're really interested in buying it? Are you interested in selling? We said, always open-minded. Anyway, we got into negotiations. We agreed a deal. And the deal took, again, 10 weeks to complete, and it completed around the end of February. So the deal got done, and what I found staggering was they acquired the business, and in the first week of acquisition, so the business remained in the existing premises, which was an office that we'd had. The buyer sent a manager over in the first week. So nobody massively senior. And then 2 weeks later, one of the kind of directors turned up, and we then hit the pandemic. So the timing for them couldn't have been worse. But the integration was appalling, because in that first 90-day period, the business, in my view, is incredibly vulnerable because it's people. So a new owner's taken in, and every employee is sitting there saying, what's the future? What about my job? What about my career? What about my customers? They've got 1,000 things going in their head, and they need the founder. They need to believe in the vision for the company. They need to believe in the vision for the future. And because we'd done the deal, we'd closed the transaction, it was done, we were no longer involved. But I watched from the outside, and I'm sure that the pandemic had a lot to do with it. But within 7 months of the deal closing, virtually everybody in the business had left. And that was literally, in my experience, down to the most appalling integration strategy I've ever experienced, because I just couldn't believe that the founder, and it wasn't a huge business, it wasn't IBM, wasn't in there every day with his arm around the people, communicating future and vision and strategy, and this is the journey, we love you, you're going to be part of the family, etc. None of that. A lot of kind of HR issues and IT issues, and this is our software and this is what we do, and you had 4 weeks holiday, we do it this way, and expense policy. But people were so disengaged. So I think the issue about integration is you need to have a very clear integration plan before you acquire the business, but also you've got to have people that have got to have bandwidth. You can't just allocate somebody who has a day job that's going to spend 20 minutes of his working day. It's too big a risk. You need a dedicated person who's got to own it from beginning to end, that has to be focused around some very clear objectives. So In our case, we have a team of 3, and these are people that are part of the management team who love the concept of acquisitions, etc. And because we have done well in this space, we've spent the money to have them. Now, if you're a smaller business, you use your existing people, but the best advice I can give you is always remember that people you've identified also have day jobs. And therefore, unless they can dedicate enough time, there is a very high risk that that transaction may not integrate well. And if it doesn't, it will cause you problems.
We have some that integrate better than others, so I know exactly what you mean. You've been very generous with your time. Would you take just 3 questions from the audience? Is that okay? Just 3 questions. We'll limit it to 3 questions. So on your screen, there's that question master participant, and you can send a message to question master, and then it appears on my screen here. And I'm going to select just 3 questions that I think are the most relevant to as many people as possible. So let's have a look. Okay, right. There are so many. This is going to be a tough choice. So Kieran McKay says, "What made you get into acquisitions?" So James, what was it that appealed to you about buying businesses rather than starting from scratch?
It's a great question. I think the answer was that because the first time it took me 17 years, as you can see from the colour of my beard, time wasn't on my side. I didn't want to take another 17 years. And I thought that the concept of buy and build, so to give an example, the first one took me 17 years. The second one took me 7. And the difference was simply because I'd acquired rather than organically built. So it was time. I wanted to accelerate the process.
Absolutely. And we all look in the mirror every day and realise we're not getting any younger. I know only too well. So if we can just bring those questions up again. Thanks, Kieran, for that question. Okay. We've got a question here. From Ling Lei says, have deals slowed down? And how do we find deals in the UK where at the moment there isn't any, you can't really have physical meetings? Interesting question.
Yeah, very good question. So for us, it hasn't really slowed down because we're still doing exactly the same job as we were doing before. We have our own way of, we don't necessarily rely just on advisors to originate deals. We actively use kind of our networking. So we know the market we're in, we know the sector we're in, and we have recently hired, I think March last year, a kind of a graduate trainee. And, there's a lot of graduates on the market today because they just can't find work. And he's a super smart guy. And we took him on, and his job is he researches the market for us. So we give him direction in terms of the market, the sector, the opportunities. There's lots of different databases and software that's available, including Companies House. He then does effectively a presentation to the team and says, look, I found a company, it's in the same market, the same sector. This is what it does. That's his LinkedIn profile. They're the set of accounts. This is what I've learned online about the company. And so we are targeting businesses directly. We then, if we can find an email address, we contact them directly. If we can't do that, we go via LinkedIn. And if we can't do that, we take their home address from Companies House, and then we write to them directly at home to say that this is a discreet conversation. We'd like to have a conversation about an opportunity we think could be of interest or something like that. And we reach out to the founders of those businesses. So, and we do it currently, it's all on Zoom.
Very, very interesting. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily appreciate this, James, but that's what I always advocate, is that you don't go through intermediaries. You want to have the direct conversation with the owner, because that's where you can get to a deal faster, probably a better deal for all concerned, and certainly faster. And also you can really understand the motivations behind that person wanting to exit or partially exit in your case. And we'll
just on that, when I've dealt with advisors